It's a warm February afternoon in 2009, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The wind blows gently across the barren desert, rustling the sagebrush and dust. A woman, unaware of the horrors that lie just beneath her feet, walks her dog along the West Mesa. As she moves, her dog stops suddenly, sniffing something in the dirt. At first, she thought it was just an animal bone, perhaps a relic from a past time. But as she bent down to examine it more closely, the realization dawned: this was no ordinary bone. It was human. A bone, exposed to the world after years of silence, and this was just the beginning. What followed was a discovery so horrifying that it would change the lives of those who lived in this quiet city forever.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
Beneath the desert soil, buried in shallow graves, the remains of 11 women and one unborn child were found, scattered across 92 acres of land. Their lives, once filled with hope, love, and dreams, now reduced to forgotten bones. But the mystery doesn't end here. Who were these women? What led them to this desolate place, to a fate so cruel? And most chilling of all, who was the monster responsible for their deaths? Why, after so many years of investigation, have the police, the FBI, failed to bring this killer to justice? These women were not strangers. They had families. They had lives. But they became lost, just like the killer who left no trace but their bones. A killer whose name still echoes in the dark corners of Albuquerque, a name we may never know, a name that still haunts the city to this very day. As time went on, the investigation deepened. Leads were followed, suspects were questioned, but the case grew colder with each passing year. And though millions of dollars were spent, the truth remained buried, just like the bodies in the desert. Why had the killer stopped? Was it fear? Was it something else? Or did they simply slip away into the shadows? In the years that followed, the families of these women never stopped searching, never stopped hoping. But as the years stretched on, hope began to wane, leaving only questions. Was justice ever going to be served? Or was the truth buried, never to be uncovered? The West Mesa Bone Collector. That's what the media has called them. But is that all they are? A name, a moniker, and a case that's left unsolved for more than a decade. The bones may have been discovered. The bodies may have been found. But the killer? Still out there, somewhere. Waiting, watching, waiting for the next move. The discovery of the West Mesa graveyard was, in many ways, an event that shocked the quiet community of Albuquerque, New Mexico, in a way they could never have anticipated. It all began on February 2, 2009, when a woman out walking her dog stumbled across a human bone on the desolate West Mesa, just west of the city. What seemed like a simple, incidental discovery would soon lead to the unearthing of a chilling secret, one that had been hidden beneath the surface for nearly a decade. The bone, a grim relic from the past, prompted an investigation that would reveal far more than anyone had imagined. Soon, forensic teams were combing through the vast desert landscape, their eyes trained on the dirt and dust that hid the remnants of a gruesome crime. As investigators dug deeper, it became clear, this was not the work of a single, isolated act, but rather the systematic disposal of life by a person who was still at large. The site, spanning a staggering 92 acres, would soon reveal itself as a mass grave, containing the remains of 11 women and an unborn child. Each woman had a story, a life interrupted. Most of them were Hispanic, with the victims ranging in age from just 15 to 32. Their lives, filled with hardship, drugs, and the grim realities of sex work, led them into the hands of a killer whose identity still eludes justice. The silence of the desert was deafening as the authorities pieced together a puzzle they couldn't yet solve. What was uncovered here, in the dust of West Mesa, was a nightmare few could have imagined. And yet, it would become the search that has never ended. The women whose remains were discovered in the desert were not just faceless bodies, they were people with lives, families, and dreams. As the investigation progressed, authorities learned about the struggles of these women, each one with her own story, a tale of vulnerability and survival. Many of the victims had ties to drugs, a fact that made them particularly vulnerable in the seedy underbelly of Albuquerque's dark corners. Others were involved in sex work, driven by circumstances that trapped them in a cycle they could not escape. They were lost to the streets they inhabited. But their bones, those bones, spoke out from the dirt. Their names were often just whispers in the night, their faces fading into the shadows. Among them were women like Jessie, a 22-year-old who was last seen walking down Central Avenue. Her story, like so many others, was marked by the grim realities of survival. Teresa, a 25-year-old mother of two, had dreams of a better life but found herself caught in the same cycle of addiction and exploitation. Claudia, just 18, had been trying to break free from the streets but was never given the chance. These were the women the killer preyed upon, and each one of their lives ended in silence. The bones they left behind told only fragments of their stories, fragments that authorities could only piece together after months of painstaking investigation. In some ways, these women were forgotten by society, marginalized by their circumstances. But their death would ignite a search for justice that would stretch on for years. The timeline of the West Mesa murders stretched across 4 years, from 2001 to 2005, each year adding to the growing fear that a killer was stalking the streets of Albuquerque. The victims had been taken from various parts of the city, often at night, their disappearance barely noted. Their ties to drugs and sex work made it easy for them to slip beneath the radar, their disappearances chalked up to the dangers of their lifestyle. By the time their bodies were discovered in 2009, the killer had already stopped his work, perhaps out of fear, perhaps due to something else. But what could drive a person to end so many lives? For law enforcement, it was a race against time. Each woman who went missing between 2001 and 2005 had left behind a trail of clues, small, fleeting glimpses of their last days. Their families had no answers, no closure. And with each passing year, the likelihood of solving the case seemed to fade. The fact that these women had lived in a world where their deaths were overlooked only made the case more tragic. Their stories, which should have been told, were lost to the streets, buried with their bodies in shallow graves under the harsh desert sun. Once the bones were discovered, the full weight of the crime was realized. The Albuquerque Police Department, APD, along with the FBI, immediately launched a large-scale investigation. They scoured the desert, recovered the remains, and began piecing together a timeline, hoping to find something, anything, that would lead them to the killer. The challenge, however, was enormous. With no clear witnesses, no solid leads, and no obvious forensic evidence, the investigation felt like a dead end. Despite the resources and attention given to the case, every lead seemed to falter. Every suspect that was brought forward ended up being a false lead, and with each failure, the case seemed to grow colder. Law enforcement struggled to connect the dots. A task force was formed, but even with the increased resources, the killer remained elusive. There was no clear suspect. No obvious person of interest. Could they have been so close, only to let the killer slip away? One detective wondered aloud in a private meeting. The thought haunted the investigators, as the weight of the unsolved case pressed down on their shoulders. Over the years, several suspects were considered. One of the names that surfaced early on was Joseph Blee, a man with a violent history who had been connected to some of the women in the area. He was questioned, but no solid evidence linked him to the killings. Another name that emerged was Lorenzo Montoya, a convicted killer who had been seen in the vicinity of the West Mesa. Again, no direct evidence linked him to the murders, and both men were ruled out as suspects. But with no arrests, the case remained an open wound, festering in the minds of the public and the families of the victims. The investigation hit another major roadblock: the condition of the remains. Most of the bodies had been buried in shallow graves, exposed to the elements for years. The decay had rendered many of the bodies unrecognizable, and forensic testing was limited. The lack of clear cause of death made it even more difficult to gather concrete evidence. The bones were the only clues the investigators had, and they spoke in fragmented whispers, offering little to help solve the case. Could modern DNA technology have been the answer? With the advances in genetic testing, investigators hoped that DNA analysis could provide the breakthrough they desperately needed. But even with the new tools, the forensic team faced an uphill battle. The remains were so badly decomposed that any DNA analysis was a long shot. Yet, they pressed on, continuing to re-examine the evidence, hoping for a breakthrough. As the years passed, law enforcement and the families of the victims continued to wait for answers. The case grew colder, and the killer remained at large. Who was this person, the detectives wondered. What drove them to take so many lives? And why haven't they been caught? The story of the West Mesa murders isn't just about the discovery of bones in the desert, it's about lives that were cut short, lives that had meaning, purpose, and dreams. These women were more than their circumstances, more than the labels placed upon them. To the world, they might have been overlooked, dismissed as mere victims of their environment. But to their families, they were daughters, mothers, friends, people with hopes and aspirations just like anyone else. Take Jessie, a 22-year-old with a bright smile and a spirit that refused to be broken, despite the hardships she faced. She had been living on the streets of Albuquerque for some time, caught in the grip of addiction, but she had dreams of a better life. Her family remembers the times when she would laugh, carefree and full of life. Her sister recalls, she always had big dreams, even if they felt impossible. Jessie wanted to get clean, to start over. She wanted to become a nurse and help others who struggled like she did. Jessie's story was one of hope despite the darkness surrounding her. That is, until she disappeared. Jessie's family would never get to see the bright future she had envisioned for herself. Then there was Teresa, a 25-year-old mother who had 2 young children she adored more than anything in the world. She spent her days trying to make ends meet, battling the demons of addiction while keeping up the appearance of a loving, dedicated mom. She was always there for her kids, Teresa's sister says through tears. She loved them more than anything, but she was trapped, and I couldn't save her. None of us could. Teresa had been working to leave the street life behind, to find a safer, healthier way to provide for her children, but before she could escape, she vanished. Her children would never see their mother again. The heartbreak that followed left a hole in her family's hearts that time has yet to heal. Even when the investigation seemed to stall, I never gave up hope. I thought they'd find her. That someone would speak up. That the truth would come to light. But, as the years went by, Marta's hope began to fade into resignation. The pain of not knowing where Claudia was or what had happened to her kept her awake for years, and it still haunts her today. Families like these had to learn to live with the gnawing emptiness that comes with unanswered questions. Teresa's children, who were just 3 and 5 years old when their mother disappeared, grew up without her. Their grandmother, who took them in, says, they ask about her sometimes. They don't understand why she's not here. All I can do is tell them that their mommy loved them, and I try to make sure they remember her, even if they never really knew her. The unresolved grief in these families doesn't just fade with time. It lingers, a constant reminder of lives lost too soon. They aren't just grieving women whose names were never made known to the public. They are grieving for mothers, daughters, and friends whose absence leaves an unfillable void. The loved ones of these women have never stopped searching, never stopped grieving. These weren't just bodies found in the desert. They were daughters, mothers, friends. The narrative shifts from the investigative details to the emotional heart of the story, the real, human cost of the tragedy. Every fact in the case, every search, every lead, holds no meaning without the personal toll on the families involved. As we focus on the victims' lives, it's clear that each of them had a future that was stolen from them, a future that no one could have predicted would end in such a brutal way. These women were marginalized by society, seen as expendable by many. But to the people who loved them, they were treasures, each one irreplaceable. Jessie, Teresa, Claudia, these were not just names in a police report. They were real people, with real lives.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
And the pain of not knowing what happened to them, of not having closure, weighs heavily on their families every day. "I don't know if I'll ever get peace," says Ellen, "but I'll keep fighting, even if it's just for answers. I have to know what happened to my daughter. I have to know who did this to her." And so, the search continues, not just for a killer, but for justice, for closure, and for the chance to give these lost lives the dignity they deserve. Now, 30 years before the West Mesa murders, in the city of Cleveland, Ohio, another killer emerged, just as elusive, just as brutal. This murderer struck in the dead of night, leaving behind a trail of horror that would stain the city's history forever. It was the 1930s, and the Great Depression was gripping America with an iron fist. For many, survival was a daily struggle, especially in the destitute neighborhoods of Cleveland. Kingsbury Run, a place known for its squalor, was a backdrop to a series of murders that would terrorize the city and haunt its residents for decades. The story of the Cleveland torso murderer unfolds in the shadows of poverty, in the underbelly of a city reeling from economic despair. In Kingsbury Run, a makeshift community of transients, sex workers, and the destitute thrived, or rather, struggled to survive. It was a place where people were forgotten by society, abandoned by hope, and pushed into the margins. It was here, in these shantytowns, that the killer found his prey. The murders were not just violent, they were surgical in their brutality. The victims, many of whom were transients or sex workers, were decapitated and dismembered with such precision that it was clear the killer knew what he was doing. The bodies were found in pieces, scattered across Kingsbury Run and surrounding areas. Some were dumped in abandoned lots, others stuffed into burlap sacks, and in one particularly chilling discovery, a woman's dismembered torso was found in a river, floating like a discarded rag doll. For this killer, it didn't matter who they were. They were simply victims to be discarded, leaving only their remains behind, illustrating the dehumanizing nature of the murders. The killer, without remorse, took apart their bodies, stripping them of their identity, leaving only the macabre evidence of his deeds. It wasn't just a crime of murder, it was a crime of erasure, an attempt to erase these lives from memory. The brutality of the killing sent a shockwave through Cleveland, leaving residents terrified of who the killer might strike next. And just as quickly as the murders began, they stopped, leaving the city to wrestle with the unanswered questions. The victims of the Cleveland torso murders were among society's most vulnerable, marginalized and invisible. Most of them were transient workers, living in the makeshift hovels of Kingsbury Run, barely scraping by. Others were sex workers, living in the shadows of the city's underworld. They were people whose lives didn't seem to matter to the world around them. But to the families and friends they left behind, these were real people, mothers, daughters, and sons, whose lives had been violently taken away. Their names were lost in the anonymity of Cleveland's darkest corners, but their deaths left an indelible mark on the city's history. The killer's choice of victims was chilling. He did not select based on age, race, or gender, but rather on vulnerability. They were all discarded by society, easy targets for someone who had no regard for their lives. As the bodies were found and identified, the true horror of the murders became clear. These weren't just deaths in the city, these were disappearances that shattered the illusion of safety, especially for those who had nothing to protect them. As the murder spree unfolded, Cleveland's most famous lawman was drawn into the investigation. Elliot Ness, the very same man who had brought down the notorious gangster Al Capone, was now faced with a mystery that even his legendary skills could not easily solve. A man who had brought down the most feared mobster in the world was now chasing shadows in Cleveland. Ness, the city's safety director, was determined to catch the man responsible for these gruesome killings. He threw all of his energy into the investigation, organizing a massive manhunt for the killer. However, as the investigation unfolded, Ness soon realized that this case would be far more elusive than any of the criminals he had faced in his career. The killer seemed to vanish without a trace, leaving behind only the remains of his victims and a trail of questions. Ness's failure to solve the case haunted him for the rest of his life. Despite his success in bringing down Capone, this case would remain one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of his career. The chilling parallels between the West Mesa bone collector and the Cleveland torso murderer are hard to ignore. Both killers targeted vulnerable women, both disappeared without a trace, and both left behind haunting, unresolved mysteries. In a time when law enforcement lacked the advanced forensic techniques we have today, both cases became a battle not just for justice but for the very truth itself. The search for these killers would stretch on, echoing in the memories of the families who still wait for answers, even decades later. Dr. Francis E. S., the suspect. As the search for the Cleveland torso killer dragged on, one name emerged as a prominent suspect, Dr. Francis E. Sweeney. Sweeney was a respected physician, well-educated and trained in the art of surgery. He was the kind of man who knew his way around the human body, with experience in performing amputations during World War I. This skill set, combined with his background in medicine, made him an intriguing figure for investigators. He was a man who knew his way around the human body. And he had secrets that even his closest friends didn't know. The Sweeney's behavior was odd. He was known to have a volatile temper and struggled with alcohol abuse, which only deepened the suspicion surrounding him. He seemed to be hiding something. Investigators learned that he had a history of mental illness, and rumors swirled that he had been seen near the sites of the murders. The pieces seemed to fit, but the evidence was not solid enough to charge him. For a time, he remained an enigma, an unsettling figure that hovered at the edges of the investigation. In a dramatic turn of events, Eliot Ness himself personally interrogated Sweeney. The tension during the questioning was thick, as Sweeney's evasive answers only deepened the suspicion. To add another layer of complexity, Sweeney underwent a polygraph test, which he failed miserably. His failure to pass the lie detector seemed to confirm the growing belief that he was the killer. However, despite this strong indication, there was still no concrete evidence linking him directly to the murders. The police had nothing that could definitively prove his guilt. For years, Sweeney taunted those who sought his capture. From his confinement in a mental asylum, he sent postcards to Ness, each one a reminder of the twisted game he had been playing. For years, Sweeney taunted the very man hunting him, sending postcards from the asylum where he would spend the rest of his life, the narrator explains. But even these sinister communications were not enough to close the case. The absence of physical evidence meant the investigation remained at a standstill. Desperation set in for the authorities. They had no clear answers, and the killer seemed to have vanished into thin air. In a final, desperate measure to force the killer out of hiding, Ness and his team set fire to the shantytowns of Kingsbury Run. The idea was to displace the transients and sex workers, hoping the killer would be flushed out in the chaos. A desperate measure, but was it enough to stop the killer? The fire did cause disruption, but it did little to solve the case. Instead of bringing the killer into the light, it only pushed him further into the shadows, and the investigation continued to falter. The burning of the shantytowns would go down as one of the more controversial decisions of the investigation, a final act of desperation that failed to yield results. As the years passed, the investigation into the Cleveland torso murders stalled. Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, once the prime suspect, was committed to a mental institution, and with his hospitalization, the trail went cold. Despite Eliot Ness's tireless efforts, the killer remained at large, his identity still a mystery. The case that had gripped Cleveland's attention slowly faded into the background, a grim chapter left unfinished in the city's history. For the families of the victims, however, the lack of closure became an ever-present weight, one that never fully lifted. But as time moved on, new hopes emerged. In 2024, the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office took a fresh step in the investigation. They exhumed the remains of some of the victims in an effort to apply modern DNA techniques, specifically investigative genetic genealogy, in hopes of finding new leads. Today, the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office has exhumed some of the victims' bodies to try new DNA methods, but will it be enough? Then, urging the audience to wonder whether this modern approach could finally reveal the killer's identity. With the advancements in forensic science, there's new hope that the case may be solved. DNA genealogy, which has cracked other cold cases in recent years, could hold the key to uncovering the truth. This new technology, capable of tracing family lines through DNA, might just bring closure to the families who've waited so long. The question remains, will it finally be enough to close the dark chapter of the Cleveland torso murders, or will the killer continue to haunt the city's history? As time has passed, both the West Mesa bone collector and the Cleveland torso killer have remained elusive, but the search for answers is not over. Thanks to advances in forensic technology, there's hope that the truth may still come to light. In the case of the West Mesa murders, authorities have been pushing for DNA testing of deceased suspects, people who might have been involved in other investigations but were never connected directly to these particular crimes. Modern DNA testing has revolutionized the way cold cases are approached, allowing law enforcement to look at old evidence with fresh eyes and new tools. This breakthrough has reignited hope that the killer's identity could be uncovered, even after all these years. For the victims of West Mesa, this new approach offers a sliver of hope for their families. With each new forensic breakthrough, we inch closer to justice, the narrator reflects, reminding the audience that the search is still ongoing, despite the case's chilling history. Could modern science finally reveal the truth behind the deaths that have haunted Albuquerque for decades? Meanwhile, in Cleveland, another groundbreaking forensic effort is underway. In 2024, the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to identifying unknown victims using DNA, partnered with the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office to take another look at the Cleveland torso murders. By exhuming the bodies of some of the victims, the project hopes to apply DNA genealogy to uncover their identities and, perhaps, lead investigators to the killer. The project has proven successful in other cases, and it represents a glimmer of hope for both Cleveland and Albuquerque. Could the breakthroughs of today be the answer to cases that have haunted us for decades? This partnership marks a turning point in the Cleveland torso case, offering a new path toward the truth. But even with DNA testing and investigative genealogy, the path forward is still long, and the killer's identity remains just beyond reach. Could this new technology finally help bring closure to the families who have lived with the agony of uncertainty for so long? Despite the different time periods and locations, the West Mesa bone collector and the Cleveland torso killer share eerie similarities. Both killers managed to slip through the cracks of justice, evading capture despite massive investigations, extensive resources, and the relentless pursuit of law enforcement. The victims in both cases were vulnerable, women whose lives were often overlooked, whose disappearances and brutal murders did not draw immediate attention. And in both cases, the killers vanished into the shadows, their faces remaining unknown, their identities a mystery that continues to haunt their respective cities. For both of these killers, their faces remain unknown, and their identities remain a mystery, drawing a parallel between these two unsolved cases. Despite years of efforts, the killers have remained elusive. But with modern forensic breakthroughs, DNA testing, genealogical research, and new investigative tools, there is still hope. Justice may be closer than ever, even if it feels as though these killers have gotten away with murder for far too long. The hunt for answers continues, and as new technologies emerge, both cases may still have a chance at resolution. The impact of these unsolved murders ripples through the lives of the victims' families, leaving scars that will never fully heal. For years, the families of those murdered by the West Mesa bone collector and the Cleveland torso killer have carried an unbearable weight, the constant search for answers, the nagging questions that go unanswered. "I wake up every day hoping for something, anything," says Claudia's mother, staring at a picture of her daughter. "How could someone do this to her? We deserve to know the truth." The longing for closure is evident in every word, every tear. These families are trapped in a loop of grief, unable to move forward because the person responsible for their pain remains unknown. As the search for answers continues, the questions that have haunted these two cases remain. Will the West Mesa bone collector ever be brought to justice? Despite the passage of years, the killer's identity is still unknown, and the families of the victims are left waiting. Will the forensic advancements of today be enough to finally uncover the truth? Can DNA finally reveal the face of Cleveland's torso killer? The Cleveland case, too, has lingered unresolved for decades, with new efforts to use genetic genealogy offering the faintest glimmer of hope. But even with these new techniques, will justice ever truly be served? The emotional weight of these cases is staggering. The families of the victims have waited years for answers, each day hoping that something, anything, will bring closure. But for now, the killers remain free, their identities hidden in the shadows. We are left with more questions than answers. The families wait. The world watches. And the killer remains free. These haunting words linger, a reminder that the search for justice is not always swift. The hunt continues, but for now, the victims' families are still waiting for the peace that can only come with knowing the truth.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.